Everyone, so in today's video, we are talking the Finest Flick glitter eyeshadows from e.l.f. This is a $6 eyeshadow from e.l.f. that is supposed to be like the Urban Decay Moon Dust shadows, right? And I was just so excited to see e.l.f. try their hand at this alternative because e.l.f. they create some absolutely great dupe products. And even if they aren't exact dupes, sometimes I like them more for different reasons. I just think e.l.f. does a really, really good job. But I think this video is going to be particularly interesting because the Moon Dust shadows from Urban Decay, this is a product I've loved for like 10 years. You guys know that like there has to be a significant chunk of my channel, probably like, I don't know, 15% at least, that is just dedicated to wet look eyeshadows. So I knew I had to do a comparison video. I hope that you guys enjoy it. And if you do, definitely make sure to give this video a thumbs up if you appreciate like all of the comparison swatches and the wear times, all of that good stuff. It just lets me know that the video was helpful. So the e.l.f. Finest Fleck Glitter Eyeshadows, I picked up all of them. Personally, for me, I think there's so much that goes into creating this kind of formula. A wet look eyeshadow is not just putting sparkles into an eyeshadow. There's just a lot more that goes into it. And I was really excited to see e.l.f.'s take on this kind of formula, especially because I haven't seen e.l.f. really do that kind of formula before. So it just got me super excited. So $6 for the Finest Fleck eyeshadows, you get 0.07 ounces, whereas you get 0.06 ounces of the Moon Dust. It's kind of negligible. All you really need to know is that these are definitely less expensive. So e.l.f. came up with 5 shades. These shades are clearly trying to dupe these shades from Urban Decay with varying success. And honestly, Urban Decay has come out with so many different shades within the Moon Dust line. Again, some have gone away, some are palette exclusive. So I'm just gonna do comparisons based on the ones that I think they are closest to. So first of all, let's talk about White Hot from e.l.f. This is clearly trying to be an alternative to Cosmic from the Moon Dust line. Cosmic is a very, very popular shade, and I am going to go ahead and say that I think e.l.f. did one of the best jobs with this specific shade. I love that they even tried to duplicate the packaging just because I love this packaging from Urban Decay. I love that you can immediately see the color. It's very flat, it's protected. I just love everything about it. So I love that e.l.f. decided to go that route. So again, White Hot is a very light, icy white. After that, we have the shade Champagne Showers. This is the alternative to Space Cowboy. It's e.l.f.'s take on Space Cowboy, and this is a light beige with a lot of champagne and very light icy sparkles throughout. What I started to notice with these two is that upon first glance, and even on my eyes, they look very, very similar. You know, so much so that I was like, I think that we have a dupe shade here. But as I've continued to wear it, what I started to realize is that the Moon Dust shadow has a stronger, slightly darker beige base. So e.l.f. does have a little bit of a beige base, but in general, it's not quite as apparent. So it ends up becoming more of a glitter, like a pressed glitter. I think the e.l.f. just in general doesn't have as much base pigment as Space Cowboy does. And granted, Space Cowboy, that beige is so translucent, but it's still there and you notice it especially in the contrast between the bright champagne glitters and the actual base pigment. So you really start to notice it. But with Champagne Showers, you don't really notice as much base pigment and it in general comes across icier. Now, I wanted to show you guys on my eyes today, again, another look at them just from far away. They look so similar that it really, you're not going to notice it too much. But when I look up close, That is the e.l.f., that is Space Cowboy, and Space Cowboy just clearly has more beige. And we'll get more into that in a second. Next, we have the shade Straight Fire. Straight Fire is actually, in my opinion, an alternative to Solstice from Urban Decay, another very popular shade. It's one of those kind of brown, purple blue duochromes. This kind of shade I have found to be very popular. A lot of brands have tried to create a similar shade to this. So I don't know. It makes sense to me that e.l.f. would try to as well, just because I think Solstice was one of the first very, very popular moon dust shades. I think these two are very, very similar as far as the shade goes. I don't think that you necessarily need to buy the e.l.f. for a dupe shade of Solstice, because I think other brands have kind of tried their hand at it and done a pretty good job, but the shades are very, very similar. I think that the Urban Decay looks slightly more wet, but I don't think that that's necessarily because of the shade itself and the pigments. I think it's because of the textures. And again, we'll talk about textures in a second. They also came out with, I think, the shade I was most excited to try, which is Filthy Rich. And this is supposedly an alternative to Lithium from Urban Decay. And Lithium is one of my favorite one and done eyeshadows that I've ever worn. So I knew that this was a shadow that I needed to try and get onto my eyes. Now, shade-wise, Filthy Rich versus Lithium. These are very, very similar. And I think the kind of main difference between the two relies more so in the texture and the formulation rather than the color. The color, though, very, very similar. And honestly, these are the ones that I'm most excited to talk about. By the way, I still have a bunch of like the old moon dust shadow component, and I'm swatching specifically Solstice and Glitter Rock from this like OG component just because I don't have the new one. So that's just like a caveat for you guys. I haven't seen really a difference between the OG formula and like the newly packaged ones, but we're more so doing shade comparisons for that. But Glitter Rock, see, this is one that I didn't bother to repurchase in the new line because it's pretty, but it wasn't ever my absolute favorite. But e.l.f. has come out with their version, which is called Pop Off Pink. It is pinky and purpley. I would say a little bit less pink to this one. And then it's Glit, which is, I'm just gonna come out and say this is like such a throwaway shade. And I don't like it. To me, this is just like a gold kind of shimmer with zero base pigment, and yet the shimmer is so flat. Complete dud. So we're really not going to talk about it in today's video. I'd rather not focus on this one because it also doesn't really have like an exact comparison, I think. Let's get into some shade comparisons and textures onto the eyes. You know, on the eyes, there are a lot of negligible differences between these. But I do think that there are differences, and again, it's my job to let you guys know them. Let's just go ahead and start with, I think, the one that everyone wants to see. Space Cowboy versus Champagne Showers. So again, what we were talking about before, I'm just seeing in general more beige base pigment to Urban Decay Space Cowboy. It's a bit stronger, which ultimately makes Space Cowboy look a little bit more wet, and it also just gives it a different kind of dimension. Again, I have the e.l.f. on this side, and it just looks more icy and a little bit more like a straight icy wet glitter rather than Space Cowboy because of that kind of beige base pigment. It looks a little bit more like skin, at least with my skin tone especially. And not only that, because the moon dust shadows almost have, depending on the shade, almost have this kind of wet texture, this coolness when you put your finger into it. It might be a little bit difficult to grasp, but it really does have this cool to the touch cream kind of feel, even though it is a pressed glitter powder. Very, very unique. None of the shades from e.l.f. necessarily feel like that, but they do melt as you continue to put your finger throughout. which I think is a really good thing, and it is a testament to e.l.f. really trying to get a similar formula to the Moon Dust. So let me give you guys a look here. So this is, again, Champagne Showers. As I continue to run my finger into the product, you see how it starts to melt and it goes a little bit glossy in the pan? That's something that the Moon Dust shadows do. So you can see that because I've used this one up so much, that it has that glossy effect on the top. It's just in general incredibly promising for the e.l.f. formula because that kind of melt on contact, slightly squishy nature of the pigments actually makes them go down onto the eyes in this really beautiful glossy way. It means that the product's going to kind of sit very closely on the lids, which helps to create a more wet effect. And that's something that I've talked about a lot in all of my various wet look eyeshadow videos, which who knows how many of them I even have on my channel at this point, but that is part of it. That is what kind of gives us this wet glossy effect, is when the glitters can be sitting very closely on the eyes. Becoming one with the skin is what ultimately creates the most realistic wet glistening effect. All this is to say is that because of this texture, e.l.f. has been able to create something that does look wet within certain shades. Ultimately, I have to be honest here, I think I like Space Cowboy more than Champagne Showers because it has more beige base pigment and it ends up just looking more natural. It looks more like my skin rather than a glitter. But I don't think that everyone's going to necessarily have that experience, which is why, at the end of the day, my reviews, I like to give you guys as much information as possible so that you can ultimately make like the best decision for you. You guys know you best. But for me personally, the kind of beigey base pigment of Space Cowboy is what I think makes it look so natural and almost kind of translucent on my skin. Another shade comparison that I thought would be really interesting for you guys is Cosmic versus White Hot. This, I think, gets very, very close. And I would say that Cosmic has slightly more of a wet glisten. And I think it's because of, again, this kind of formula from Urban Decay, that kind of creaminess to it. Again, it's just going to help everything sit closer on the skin and just reflect a little bit better. And I've talked about this before on my channel, but again, think about it. When you have like standing water, for example, you're looking at a very, very calm lake, you can kind of get that mirror-like reflection. When you have more roughness or like waves or, whatever, if you're thinking about smooth surfaces, you're more likely to get a mirror-like reflection just from like a physics standpoint. So when the moon dust has a little bit more creaminess to it, that is when you get that more mirror-like reflection. As far as, once they're actually on the eyes, because the base pigment is so sheer, I think that you can get away with calling this one a dupe. As far as Lithium versus Filthy Rich, I think that Filthy Rich, the actual glitter particles throughout, they're a little bit more grungy brown green. There are some champagne sparkles in here as well, but they're not quite as prevalent. So I think that makes Lithium look a little bit more wet. And then again, in combination with this kind of texture, it's going to be a little bit more wet and reflective and have a little bit more of those champagne glitzes. However, Filthy Rich from e.l.f., this shadow is beautiful. So again, I like to kind of add a little bit of nuance, even though I don't think that this is an exact dupe. It is incredibly beautiful on its own. We'll also talk about wear time because wear time is something else to consider. Ultimately, Filthy Rich is just an absolutely beautiful, grungy, wet looking eyeshadow for $6 that you can get at the drugstore. So for me, that's like, it's a win. It doesn't need to be an exact dupe in order to have like its own merit and beauty. Though I think Lithium has a little bit more wetness and I do slightly prefer the color because I really enjoy a champagne sparkle. I still really, really enjoy this one. But let's talk about wear time. So wear time has been something that has been very interesting for me in testing out these alternatives. I think it's been a little bit more difficult for me to really tell which one of these wears longer, specifically because of these kinds of formulas and because in general the Moondust shadows tend to have more translucent bases to them, like this kind of creamy base that you can sheer out more easily. Also, another thing to keep in mind with wear time between the Moondust and the e.l.f. is that the Moondust shadows are creamier, so I think that they will crease more readily than the e.l.f. will. Because the e.l.f. is slightly less creamy to the touch, I think they're gonna hold up on their own longer, which has at least been my personal experience. That in combination with the base pigment, I think these last longer in general. You know, looking at my eyes today, again, that is the e.l.f. in Champagne Showers versus a Space Cowboy. I actually think that for those of you that want just a really beautiful, like champagne, icy kind of wet glitter at the drugstore, you're gonna be so happy with this because it is so beautiful in its own right. I think what makes Space Cowboy for me different and what makes it special is that slightly beige base pigment that ends up making it just look kind of one with my skin, but that's not going to be the case for, again, for everyone. There's kind of a naturalness to the Moondust that I just particularly really like. But I feel like I couldn't talk about this launch in general without also mentioning that we've kind of already had a dupe to Space Cowboy for a while now with a texture that is more similar, which is Ritz from ColourPop. Ritz from ColourPop is, in my opinion, not going to last quite as long as Space Cowboy because it's even creamier. You know, it has more of a putty texture. And in general, I think that that's okay, but if you want the closest thing I've ever found to an exact dupe to Space Cowboy, I would go with Ritz rather than Champagne Showers from e.l.f. And it's not because I don't think that this is beautiful, but if we're talking about, you know, like duplicates, then that's what I would lead you to. If you really want to be able to experience that kind of translucent beigey base pigment. My personal favorites from e.l.f. and the ones that I like the most are the ones that I've been harping in on. I do really like Champagne Showers. I think Filthy Rich is beautiful. And in specific, this is the one I'm most excited about because I think that this is what the drugstore is so often missing. Like these really wet, deeper shades. I think the drugstore is now more likely to create shades similar to like Cosmic, like these icy white glitters or again like White Hot from e.l.f., which is the, you know, the alternative to Cosmic. I think we're getting more of those kinds of shades at the drugstore, but I don't think we have as many of these. I am very excited that I picked these up, even just to have discovered this product to recommend to you guys. I think Filthy Rich is beautiful. It also it lasts longer than Lithium, again, just from a textural standpoint. I think it's absolutely beautiful and I highly recommend it. Overall, I think the e.l.f. Finest Fleck shadows, I think that they're beautiful. There are a couple of dud shades like I mentioned, but as a whole, I just love to see it. I think I trust e.l.f. the most out of any other brand to do their take or their dupe version of these popular products that everyone really loves. Overall, I think they did really an incredible job. Even though there are differences, I don't think they need to be exact dupes to be beautiful in their own right. I think that that's, you know, very important to me. I'll leave links to all of the products I talked about today below, but overall, thank you guys so much for watching. I really hope it was helpful. So if it was helpful, definitely let me know by giving me a thumbs up. And also let me know down below, have you tried these? If you will, what shade are you going to pick up? And overall, again, thanks for being here, and I'll see you in my next one.